Good evening and welcome. My name is Melissa Chu and I'm director of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. It's my privilege to welcome tonight our distinguished scholars who'll be speaking, Richard J. Powell and Sarah Elizabeth Lewis. This is one of the many virtual offerings of the Hirshhorn that we've been doing for the last 18 months, and we're looking forward to this evening and the many more programs planned for the fall. Thank you, Richard and Sarah, for being with us tonight. Richard J. Powell is the John Spencer Bassett Distinguished Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. He's an internationally recognized scholar of African American art and culture, as well as arts of the African diaspora and contemporary visual studies. He's a frequent lecturer and media commentator on these subjects. Sarah Elizabeth Lewis is an associate professor of the history of architecture and African American studies at Harvard University. Her Vision and Justice issue of Aperture magazine won the 2017 Infinity Award for Critical Writing and Research from the International Center of Photography. This evening, we are celebrating and reflecting on the release of the third edition of Rick's book, titled Black Art, A Cultural History from the World of Art series by Thames and Hudson. It really was one of the earliest and most significant scholarly assessments of African American art and culture. Doctors Powell and Lewis will discuss some of the key themes, moments in history, artists and artworks that are featured in this important book. We thank Thames and Hudson for their support of tonight's program. Please do come back and join us next month for our Artist Talk series, all online, which continues on Wednesday, October 20th, with a conversation with Rick Lowe in conversation with Antoine Sargent. And if you are in DC, please do visit the museum, where we have exhibitions by Laurie Anderson, Nicola Patti, and Mark Bradford, amongst others. And coming up in the fall, we have exhibitions by Abigail DeVille and Toyin Oju Odotola. Please join me in welcoming Rick Powell and Sarah Elizabeth Lewis. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. What a thrill and really an honor it is to be here with you tonight. I hope you don't mind. I really like to begin by saluting you with some opening remarks and have a discussion about this extraordinary third edition of Black Art, A Cultural History. I am here, of course, as you all know, with my extraordinary colleague, an exemplary leader in the field, Professor Rick Powell, on the occasion of this release of the indispensable volume, Black Art, published by Thames and Hudson. And I want to thank our colleagues at the Hirshhorn Museum, Melissa Chu and Amy Baer, for making this possible. Now, as many of you know, Professor Powell's work and scholarship has made a home for so many in the field by the power of his example, his curiosity, his rigor, and care for the development of the field. And I'm certainly no exception. Art historians, artists, and curators have long known that you, Rick, are at the headwaters of the field of Black art and visual culture. Now, all of you watching, if you consider me here sitting before you as merely one in a line of hundreds of other scholars and curators and artists, all who've had their work and thoughts and imagination shaped by Professor Powell's scholarship and are here also genuflecting to him, you'll get a sense of the warmth of the crowd that I know is with me in spirit as I pay tribute to him in this initial salute tonight. So I hope you'll bear with me, as it's not every day that we have a chance to salute one of the giants in the field in such this way. We are here to discuss and celebrate Black art, but to put this in context, this is one of Professor Powell's over 6 books, 8 exhibition catalogs, and by my last count, over 71 essays and journal articles on topics ranging from primitivism to postmodernism. These titles include such landmark works as Homecoming, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson, to Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture, the show and exhibition catalog, Archibald Motley, Jazz Age Modernist, and Going There, Black Visual Satire. But what I value so much about the introduction to the field that Professor Powell's scholarship frames and offers for us is the focus on the capaciousness of the field of Black cultural production and the strategies that artists employ to produce knowledge and question narratives, exemplified in this new Thames and Hudson volume. Many of us know that it would be impossible to enter the field of African American and African diasporic art history without passing through the barreled archway that his scholarship represents. Tried to design a course on Black art without it, and it's like serving students a Swiss cheese version of the field. It would be filled with holes where probing insights about Black figuration, Black satire, for example, should be. How could you teach a course and not mention include one of his many curatorial contributions? And these range from, of course, the Black aesthetic to Rhapsodies in Black, to Conserve a Legacy, to Back to Black. These exhibitions have taken place at a range of institutions, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, to the New Orleans Museum of Art. But this new edition of his volume, Black Art, is an extraordinary feat, which brings us together tonight. It requires a delicate calibration of both chronological and conceptual capaciousness and precision. It's rare to have a book that is at once a study and a revised thematic survey, now with 9 chapters, that endures. Before we have a conversation and then open up for a discussion, I'd like to underscore that Black art, as well as all of Professor Powell's scholarship, reminds us of both the stakes and the breadth of the field, and of the deep historical knowledge and visual literacy required to read the cultural landscape today. The book is also a gift for the future. Now, in closing, there are a number of things I could go on to say about Professor Powell's landmark exhibitions and scholarship. That is to say, he is a builder. But let me leave you with one final example of what I mean. Some time ago now, Professor Powell convened a workshop on African diasporic arts and Black aesthetics at Duke University. Many of us have been to fantastic workshops, and this was nothing short of a stellar experience, but it contained a unique feature. All of the presenters were advanced graduate students that he felt had promise. I was fortunate enough to be among them. The audience members were comprised of tenured and tenure-track faculty, professors of art history and performance studies from around the country, who he had flown in after receiving a grant to offer feedback on our dissertation chapters, and he also invited editors from Duke University Press. I cannot overstate what an inspiration this was to those of us presenting our work, but in hindsight, I see it now as a moving tribute to his commitment to the health and the continuation of the field. All 6 of those graduate students, myself included, have gone on to receive positions in the field at various institutions. And we are so fortunate to have the power of his example to guide us. So for these many reasons, countless truly, I'd like to thank you, Professor Powell, and congratulate you before we even begin this conversation on yet another monumental achievement that's such a generative gift to us all, as you are.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm speechless, but I'm thinking about when I first met you, which was in London. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh my God, yes.
It was at Royal Festival Hall, and I was hanging out with colleagues from the museum and David Bailey and you. I don't know why you were there, but you were there, and and it was just a delightful meeting, you know.
You know, I remember I was there on a Marshall Scholarship after graduating from college, and I was studying at the Courtauld and at Oxford, and was, you know, burying myself in books that would allow me to understand the field. And then you appeared, and I thought, this is a sign. It meant to go back, and yes. So,
Yeah.
well, again, you know, this is such an exciting time, and I want to encourage everyone in the audience to start thinking already of your many questions, because we certainly can't cover the whole of this extraordinary volume. But I want to think about this book actually in the context of what you just mentioned, these earlier moments, right, in which Black art was still the foundational volume that it is today. And one of the feats that you've accomplished with this is that you've created an elastic structure, right, through which you've been able to revise and expand upon these medium-specific categories, but also conceptual categories over the course of decades, right? And so I want to just open, and we can maybe call up slides if you'd like, or just open by discussing this, but open with a question for you about, well, two things. You open the book with a discussion of what you call the changed status of visual art, right, since the second edition of the publication in 2002. And I wondered if you could say more about how you define that changed status and what you saw as the most urgent developments to convey as you revised this volume.
That's a great question. Maybe we can go to the second slide, which will show all three covers of the book. Thank you. So it's funny that London looms in this whole discussion, Sarah, because I was approached in the mid-1990s by Nikos Stangos, renowned editor who worked for Penguin. And he said, we want to do a book on African-American art. And I said, well, yeah, I'd be really interested in doing that. But I guess I realized at that moment that it had to be broader than just Afro-US, that it had to take account of all of this exciting stuff that was happening in London, things that were happening around the world in Africa. And so edition one, which came out in 1997, attempted to be that summational book. Yes. And I want to stress that word summational because the World of Art series made its name not for being encyclopedic, but for providing this kind of broad understanding of that which has occurred in the world of art history, yes. Which means being not, again, encyclopedic, but really touching on important key elements over time. The other thing that the Thames and Hudson World of Art series underscored to me when I first got introduced via Nikos was its significatory dimension, meaning that it's your responsibility as an author to really look at those touchstones, those moments that really do merit pausing and reflecting. And finally, I was given the license to be thematic and not to just try to say everything about anything, but to really come up with some key ideas and issues. So that's what spawned edition one. And I continued with that with edition two. But then with edition three, which was 20 some years after edition two, I realized that the world had changed, that the art world had changed. That there were not just new names, but new issues that had arisen that really had to be attended to, that had to be thought about with just how, not just how artists of African descent had kind of represented themselves in a way in the 21st century that was unlike anything that happened before, but the other issue of the stakes, the challenges of Blackness in the 21st century. And I mean, that came so clear to us with all sorts of things that happened in the past, 10 years. I don't even have to go back beyond that. So the charge of edition three was to address all of that, the both the highs and the lows. And so with that introductory section, I tried to kind of frame for people just all of the different things that have happened in terms of the profession of new young peoples of African descent, not just teaching, but writing, curating, administering, being part of auction houses. This was unprecedented. This had not happened before. But also new ideas that were being presented that really hadn't been addressed before, like outsider art, like art that is perceived of and understood as kind of outside of the genteel world of of Black folk, you know. In other words, works that really grapple with class and identity in ways that are even more transformative and challenging than, let's say, the Black arts movement of the 60s or the Harlem Renaissance movement of the 1920s and 1930s. So all of that is kind of contained in this new edition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are many different themes that you focus us on in what's an addition to the third edition, and that's the final chapter, right? In chapter 9. I want to address a few of the themes that will allow us to also engage with many of the images here. One of the themes that I can imagine you had to engage with perhaps differently is that of media, right? It's been on my mind for a number of days now, this question, in part because the team, the Distribution and Arts Advocacy Collective Array, co-founded by Ava DuVernay, released a new 4K restoration of Sankofa, debuting on Netflix, and screened Ashes and Embers on just a few days ago on Saturday, a beginning of a set of tributes to Mr. Haile Gerima. And of course, Sankofa is one of the key objects, in the volume. It was such a profoundly instructive, I think, film for so many. And in fact, when I had the chance, really the honor to interview Mr. Gerima with Dagmai Wobeshet for a Callaloo conference in 2012, it struck me that your observation is so needed and acutely sort of resonant today, that the place of cinematic vision, as you call it, hasn't fully been captured by how we teach the field of Black art. And so your book was so prescient in doing this decades ago. And so as you expand the focus on media, can you just walk us through some signal moments? As you say, it's not about being encyclopedic, but just choosing a few moments that allow us to see the centrality of media today.
Sarah, you're wonderful, because you pick up on something that was really always there from the very beginning. I knew that if I had to do this book, that I could talk about painting and sculpture and printmaking, but I knew that if one really wanted to pay tribute to the 20th century, one would have to address media. And the media that one would have to address would be photography. But as we move deeper and deeper into the 20th century, cinema is something that has to be accounted for. So from the very beginning, I'm talking about James Van Der Zee. From the very beginning, I'm talking about Daoud Bey and Carrie Mae Weems. And in terms of cinema, there was no way that I could ignore figures like Oscar Michaud or Spencer Williams. But even taking that further, because again, the first edition was 1997. So we've already been witness to the genius of Spike Lee, to the wonderful films, independent films by Camille Billups. And so all of that had to be there. But I'm so glad you mentioned Haile Gerima. I'm a graduate of, before I did my PhD at Duke, at Yale, I did my MFA at Howard. And I never worked with Haile Gerima, but I knew of him, and I knew of his genius, and I knew of his importance as this pivotal filmmaker. And when I look at this image from Sankofa, I'm really thinking about Kerry James Marshall, because Kerry James Marshall worked on both this film, and he also worked on Daughters of the Dust. And he often talks about his experience with Daughters of the Dust as a love fest. That's where he met his wife, Cheryl Lynn Bruce. Yes. He talked about working with Haile Gerima in different terms. I'll just put it like that. It was a challenge with the shoot in Ghana and in Jamaica. But the film, as you said, is one of the most important films that was created at the end of the 20th century. I mean, can you imagine the story about a Black fashion model posing in the slave castles of Ghana, suddenly transporting herself or being transported back to slavery and encountering slave masters and whips and abuse and ultimately a revolt? I mean, it was a wild story, but it was a really important story. So it's really important that that this film is now available for the world to see. I just decided to juxtapose it though with Arthur Jaffa because Arthur was a witness. He was on Daughters of the Dust as well, and he was also at Howard with Haile Gerima, and he's continued to do important, significant, valuable work for us to this day. And so it was always a part of this project to think broadly about media, the photography as well as the film, and to think about film as art, as opposed to just simply as entertainment.
Yeah. I want to actually interject a question here that I've always wanted to ask you. And it has to do with your capacious embrace of the various media that populate Black art. You mentioned receiving your MFA, and I hope everyone in the audience caught that, right? MFA. So I want to ask you about kind of multiple identities. Now, I use this term, but it's one you use to salute David Driscoll, right? In your intellectual biography in the exhibition catalog, David Driscoll, Icons of Nature and History. You salute his multiple identities, but you have them as well, right? As an artist, as a curator, as an advocate, as a scholar. So I want to know if those different identities are modes that allow you to delve differently as a scholar, for example. Is there a curiosity that comes from a medium-specific interest that emerges from the artistic side? Can you speak to us about that?
Yes. It could very well be that I just am interested in a lot of things. And I started off, I didn't know what an art historian was when I was growing up in Chicago, but I knew about art. I knew about artists like Richard Hunt and Margaret Burroughs. And at that point, I was really dedicated to being in the world of art. But it's funny, when I got to Morehouse and when I got to Howard, I began to meet scholars. I began to meet writers. I began to meet performers. And I began to realize that one could be engaged with the arts, plural, and one could do it in multiple complex, layered, nuanced ways. And so there's always been a part of me that has valued my experience as a practitioner. And I'm still making art. Nobody knows much about it, but in my quiet moments, I'm drawing and thinking about, images and what have you. But clearly I chose, by the time I got my MFA and I was in New York working at the Met, that I wanted to write, and I wanted to write about people who nobody was writing about. And so I think your intuition is right, that my schizophrenia, being interested in the visual, being interested in writing, being interested in the culture, meant that all of these things kind of inform and shape one another.
Well, I should also make sure the audience knows what I do know, which is that your works are in many private hands and public collections, right? And including the Library of Congress and the Yale University Art Gallery. I'm sure there are many others. I could list many more. So I do know about this part of your past, and it's also part of mine. I began as an artist. That's how I entered the field as well. And so I share that kind of orientation.
And we're not alone. James Porter painted and also was an art historian. Samela Lewis was a practitioner. Romy Bearden is an artist, but also a writer. And so I think part of being part of the African-American cultural nexus means that you can do multiple things, that you're assumed that you can do multiple things.
Exactly, absolutely. Well, I'd like to ask you a question that will probably bring us around to the slides. In part, this has come to mind as we're thinking about the way in which we are called to do many, many things. We've, I think, all recently seen the detonation that came from two extraordinary portraits. President Barack Obama and former First Lady, or forever First Lady in my mind, Michelle Obama, by, of course, Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald, respectively. And outside of the volume Black Art, your scholarship is focused on, I guess, what I would call the double load of portraiture by these two artists, in that these works have chronicled a cultural shift, as you described it, but they also signal a very specific changed context in which we are seeing portraiture today. Can you speak to us about the significance, I mean, again, of including the Wiley portrait as part of the Black art volume, what you hope this will say, right, to future readers, say decades from now, regarding the development of Black art?
Absolutely. Again, edition 2 was written in 2001 and it was published in 2002. And I can't underscore enough all of the amazing artists who emerged and made themselves known in that intervening moment between 2002 and the present. And one of those artists was Kehinde Wiley. I wrote about Kehinde Wiley in my 2008 book, Cutting a Figure. I had been seeing his work and was really intrigued with it. So when the time came for this third edition, I knew there was no way that I could not include as someone key and part of making us rethink notions of portraiture and the like, Kehinde Wiley. I incorporate him in a section of this new chapter called Precarity and Portraiture. And I purposely wanted to have this tension between the idea of likeness, but also the idea of precarity, dis-ease, and the tension of representation and self-representation. And I thought that Kehinde, in many respects, including this great portrait of President Barack Obama, is able to address all of those ideas. I mean, it's a work that on one hand is so right on in terms of capturing this man's essence. And on the other hand, the way it's posed and presented brings up, as so many of Kehinde Wiley's best works do, they bring up something that's quite mortal, something that's quite human, something that's quite fragile about identity, particularly Black male identity. And for all of the love that we have for President Barack Obama, I think that throughout the time that he was president, there was always, at least amongst my people, there was always this hope and prayer that he would make it through, that he would survive the madness of the realities of living in the 21st century. And I think Kehinde just really captured it. So basically, I mean, there was no way I could do this new chapter without paying deference to Kehinde's incredible insight in terms of how you capture Black bodies and do it in a way that incorporates this sense of mortality.
Yes. Between the second and third volumes of the book, there have been a number of political, social, and civic events of just monumental importance, right? And of course, this portrait speaks to, or in a summation, to many of them. But you've also included works that are made by artists who are focusing on the social landscape in a very particular way through a kind of social practice, you might say, Mark Bradford sort of foremost among them. The inclusion of Mithra, I thought, was so prescient and important for, say, those reading it decades from now to understand this current moment. Can you speak to us about the decision to include Mithra in particular and Mark Bradford's work in particular?
Sure. I was very lucky to go to the New Orleans Prospect display. I had been spending a lot of time in New Orleans prior to Katrina. I had organized an exhibit of John Scott, fantastic sculptor, that opened in the early summer of 2005. And by the end of that summer, New Orleans was not the same. And I was lucky enough to be a part of a conversation some years after that in New Orleans at the Arthur Roger Gallery. And Dan Cameron said, I'm going to do this big display of international art in New Orleans to celebrate our return. And one of the first artists, or one of the first displays, was in 2008, and it included Mithra. And it was a remarkable work of art. I mean, there's no easy way to describe it. This huge ship made out of plywood with a crate, built inside of it or incorporated inside of it, and incorporating Mark Bradford's, wonderful torn pieces of posters and circulars from the streets of Los Angeles. I mean, to me, it really encapsulated just this kind of surreal post-Katrina moment that on one hand was we survived the flood, but on the other hand, what comes next? Mm-hmm. And one could say that this whole chapter, which is called The Price of Blackness, is about that dialectic, that we survived the flood, mm-hmm. but what are we facing as we move further into the world? Mm-hmm. And so again, this was one of those pivotal works that had to be incorporated. And of course, Mark has done amazing things since then. But to me, this piece really did speak to a really prescient moment at the beginning of the 21st century.
No. One of the many reasons that I so salute Mark Bradford's practice is that he's asking one of the fundamental questions of the 21st century as an artist, which is, what is the ground? Well, and the figure-ground relationship, dominates so much of the discussion of representation, but he's really asking this in a more radial way. Like, how have we structured the ground here? And I raise this because it's an active question that positions him as an artist, but also as an activist in many ways. It makes me think of another reason why Black art is such a seminal text, and it's because you dare to define Black aesthetics as a kind of doing, right, early on. And so it's, to me, both no surprise and quite important that Mithra would populate the third edition.
And Sarah, I end this section talking about the successes, mm-hmm. and the accolades, yeah. and the prices of incredible African-American art by artists like Mark Bradford, David Hammonds, Julie Moretu, Kerry James Marshall. So on one hand, we have this work that you're absolutely right is about social issues and questions of justice, but it's also work that has suddenly become, a commodity in a way that artists of earlier generations could have never imagined.
That's right. That's right. And I would argue that they are imbricated in one another. The fact of the work's agency is concomitant with the fact that it is now being valued in a new way. I'd like to actually ask a question that is a bit of a planted one. I gave an advanced copy to one of my graduate students at Harvard, Kayla Jackson, who is doing wonderful work focused on African diasporic art. And she wanted to ask a question specifically about the market, in part. Her question was about whether your necessary attention to institutions, that acquire and exhibit Black art of African diaspora, and the market in particular, transforms the way that we engage with global art histories and the discipline itself. That is to say, is the role, right, of the market and values now so important that we must even think about that as a feature, right, of the discipline in ways that we couldn't, say, 30 years ago?
We can't ignore it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way to talk about these artists or to talk about this moment without acknowledging how much of a presence artists of African descent have. Mm-hmm. And that they never had before. I remember a lecture that Kerry James Marshall gave at Duke some years ago, and he talked about some of those artists like Romy Bearden and Jacob Lawrence and William H. Johnson, and he just mentioned that for them there was never the idea you couldn't even conceive of connecting with a gallery that would market and promote your work and put it up for auction for the most amazing prices that artists were experiencing just at the moment that he was speaking. Mm-hmm. And so there's no way we can separate this commodification of Blackness that is very much a part of the 21st century world. And I think it poses a lot of questions about value and what does value mean? Yeah. Years ago, I wrote a piece for a think tank at Yale about this kind of breadth of understanding and thinking about Black culture. And I guess that was almost like a prelude to what's happening now, where suddenly, as we move to the end of the 20th century and move well into the 21st century, these new stakes have emerged that have to do with the commodification of Blackness. And many issues come out of that. One of the issues that comes out of that is agency. I mean, who's in control? Who determines how one engages, how one purchases, how prices will be set, who will acquire, who won't acquire, because it's a two-sided element there. I mean, as somebody who worked on historically Black colleges and universities for years, I have to constantly remind people that years and years ago, they were the patrons for African-American artists. I mean, the Howards and the Hamptons and the Spelmans and the Fisk, they were buying William H. Johnson when nobody else was interested in this crazy Black artist from New York City, you know? And now they can't afford any of this material because it's a very, very selected body of collectors and patrons who can. And that's to be celebrated, but it's also to be reflected upon in terms of our culture and access and just what it means.
Mm-hmm. I agree. One of the interventions I thought of the HBO documentary Black Art, in which I was honored to be part of with you, was to be able to make that point, right, to the public about the reconsideration of institutions that in fact did contain and support and extend the value of Black art and historically Black colleges. The focus on value is a subtext of the title, The Price of Blackness, of course, and the value, but you've also included a work that kind of riffs on this in a way with Blackness for Sale. And I wonder if we might talk about that briefly, if we could show the work on the screen through, let's see.
Well, while we're pulling it up, I'll just say a little bit about it. Yes. It's also one of those pivotal artworks that occurred in the fin de siècle. And in addition to, I didn't discuss it, because it just happened at the moment that I was doing edition 2. But when I did edition 3, I said, oh, I've got to go back to Keith and Mindy Obadike, who used eBay, who posted a link on eBay that said, I am selling my Blackness. And these are the terms under which my Blackness is for sale. And it was ironic and it was satirical, but it was also incredibly profound, and it was prescient given the conversation that we just had about what's going to happen in the 21st century. That Keith and Mindy would give us this long, and if people get a chance, they just got to read it. You know, this Blackness may be used for securing the right to use the term sister, brother, or you know what, in reference to Black people. Be sure to have a certificate of authenticity on hand when you, in other words, they really are playing with these ideas, but they are ideas that really do give one pause for thinking about what happens when peoples of African descent, their culture, their creativity becomes a commodity, becomes available for not just the Black community, not just for those people who have patronized Black culture for the longest in their own little ways, but when it becomes something that pops up in auction in Hong Kong or in Bern, Switzerland, or what have you. In other words, this Blackness has really suddenly become something that that one has to contend with, and the artists. It really puts a lot of onus on the artists in terms of, you know, how what they do connects or doesn't connect anymore with the community that is ostensibly the inspiration for it.
There are many works to discuss in this volume, and before we open up for questions, maybe in about 5-10 minutes, I want to make sure we have time to also really reflect on, I think, one of the key touchstones of the past 20 years, decades, last 5 years, and that is memorials and monuments. Both occupy dominant thematic space in these cultural narratives. Actually, as one of countless examples, just 2 hours ago, there was the launch of the National Monument Audit commissioned by the Mellon Foundation, led by the work of Paul Farber at Monument Lab. And one of the key works, well, there are many here, and showing you on the screen here, works by Hank Willis Thomas and Rashid Johnson, but one of the key works in your new chapter as well is the Equal Justice Initiative's memorial to Peace and Justice, which is in effect a memorial to lynching, to those unnamed, now known, often lives that were taken by this national phenomenon of racial terror, originated by Brian Stevenson and co-designed by the nonprofit architectural design firm Mass Design. And of course, you also include the now 5-year-old, but always feels so almost permanent already, landmark, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, of which you were part of the organizing body and team. So can you speak to us about how you envision and place the function of memorialization and monuments in this narrative kind of summational arc of the book?
Yes, I want to also again go back to the second edition, where at the end of that book, I talk about this idea of a National Museum of African American History and Culture, which in the early 2000 moment, like 2000, 2001, they were looking at the Art and Industry Building in Washington, D.C. So that's what I put in the book. So little did I know that I was going to be part of this committee, and that Lonnie a bunch in his vision was going to be able to convince Congress that we would have this museum on the mall, and that it would be a new built building. It would not be based on another building, and they would incorporate this brilliant architect, David Auger. But as I write in the text, around that same time, Brian Stevenson has decided that they've got to do something concrete, something structural, something commemorative, something on the scale of a building that will pay tribute to these many names that many people just don't have, the victims of racial violence that occurred in the 19th century, moving well into the 20th century. Sarah, I was blessed a couple of years ago to be able to go to Montgomery. Yeah. And when I got to Montgomery and saw the memorial, I said, oh, wow, there's no way I can do this book without acknowledging the genius of Brian Stevenson and Mass Design Group to create something that is, on one hand, very modern. I mean, the design is kind of international style, but the simplicity and the power of the scale and the gradation of the land, of the research that was done to give us specific counties and dates and names. I mean, there's nothing like this in the world. I compare it a little bit to things in Germany and things in South Africa, but there's really no comparison to any of those with what the National Memorial for Peace and Justice has done. I know you've worked a lot with Brian, and so I'm sure you can share a little bit as well about his vision.
Mm-hmm. I, like you, was truly blessed to be able to witness the site, to go when it was being built, in part because of the commission that Aperture offered to Brian and I to be in conversation around the work of culture for creating narratives to upend injustice, and felt very much the same way, that I couldn't do any of my work without situating and centralizing the project that was underway in Montgomery. The question that I had internally, and was one that I've vocalized more publicly since, is what does it say about our work in this field that a lawyer, right, would turn not to law, but to the arts to think about racial narratives in this country? What does it say about the power of and the signals offered through monuments and memorials, right? The unheralded power, I would argue. And the fact that the opening also coincided with the announcement of the opening of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture was, I believe, intentional, and deliberate. In effect, I think part of why I love the pairing and am so thrilled about the inclusion is that we are also seeing the ways in which our field is kind of being pushed out into the world beyond, right, our art history.
And I also want to add that it's in Montgomery, Alabama. So it's not in New York.
Exactly.
It's not in LA. It's a place that you have to make a pilgrimage to the South, which is the site of so much history, so much violence, and so much beauty and potential. Alabama is an incredibly rich state in terms of the arts, the folk arts. And now we have this memorial there. So I felt like as I did this project that I didn't want to just park on the easy stuff that you would see in a gallery in New York or in LA, that you'd have to see some interesting things in places like Paris for Kipwani Kiwanga, or again, the memorial in Montgomery, Alabama.
That's right. And it's designed to be, as it states, a national memorial, right? Meaning it does not have to be in Washington, D.C. for the pilgrimage to take place. There are many, many works, I think, that show us also the participatory kind of function, right, of art and culture today. And you genuflect to many of them. I think that in the interest of time, I want to make sure we're integrating a few of the questions that we received, and we can continue the discussion with some of the images we might not have gotten to yet. I know that there's, one that dovetails with a question that I had here, and it really is about how you open the book with a discussion of, I would say, Black mastery and craft and kind of artisans, right? And there's a question here, about thoughts on the placement of African-American, African ceramic artists. And I'm here thinking about Dave Drake and others. I'm here thinking about the developments that have happened in our field that go beyond what we might call just a ceramic artist, that allows us to see, again, mastery as broader in the Kerry James Marshall sense that we might have initially conceived of it. Can you speak about Black craft and artisanship a bit?
Absolutely. Again, one of the challenges of a text like this is, again, to be summational, but also to be thematic and significatory. And I started the first image in the book, as perhaps the questioner noted, is a drum. It's a drum that was made in colonial Virginia. We think. we actually don't know for certain. It's a drum that looks very much like something that you might see among the Akan in what was then called the Gold Coast. It might be something that comes from what was then called Dahomey, but it was found in Virginia, and it ends up in London in the British Museum. And so for me, what I was after by incorporating that and starting with that was the conundrum of what might be called Black art. And for me, it is art. Just as a painting is art, just as Harriet Powers' quilt later in the next chapter is art, just like a building by Brian Stevenson and the Mass Design Group is art. And so there were a number of opportunities to kind of stretch that definition. And at the same time, there was the challenge of telling this story in a way that would kind of keep my audience intrigued. I remember years and years ago talking to an editor who told me that you have to tell a good story. You have to tell a story that keeps your reader spellbound and connected from one chapter to another to another. And so I confess that there is a method to this book that pays deference to the pictorial, along with the historical, but also those key objects that will again keep the story rolling and moving along. And so it was always my intention to be as Catholic in my definition, but at the same time to not lose people's expectations for, you know, the amazing kinds of things that have happened over the past several hundred years.
Mhm, mhm. We have several questions here. One, I think, is one that will speak to a question that I had as well, which is about the subtitle, A Cultural History, right? So there's much to say here, but at the time, I think the framework of a cultural history, for say the first edition, was a truly innovative, almost radical move, right? And the capaciousness that it allows for is, I would argue, part of the reason for its endurance. The questioner here, the journalist, was speaking to the cultural history piece here and wanting to know more about how you see the role of the Black Lives Matter movement and the production of art as part of this narrative. So can you speak about both sort of questions here, the cultural history?
Sure. This book is chronological, essentially. It starts, as I said, in the late 17th century with that drum, and takes us all the way to Wangechi Mutu's incredible art in the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2019. So that kind of helped me in terms of a path. I knew where I was going. I knew what stops I had to make along the way, and so there was a real attempt to kind of spell out that chronological story, but also not to be afraid to have moments of pause and reflection on particular episodes over time. I think in the first chapter I talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and his engagement with these Pan-African events. In the chapter that follows that, I talk about the new Negro and just what that means in Harlem versus Chicago versus Paris. Yeah. In the next chapter, I talk about the Great Depression, not just something that's U.S. but international. And you see my point. Yes. So I think that when we ended up with the second edition and changing the name from Black Art in the 20th Century to Black Art, A Cultural History, I think my editors were feeling like, okay, let's build up this story about the story. Let's build up this narrative about a trajectory and these moments and these episodes. And being the good writer that I am, I work with my editors and I say, okay, I think you've got it going on. But back to Black Lives Matter. This last chapter was written in the midst of protests, of anxiousness, of anxiety around race. Yeah. And clearly we saw it in the media. And I think that one of the things that occurred to me, and I talk about this in the last chapter, is how artists find a way to acknowledge these issues without perhaps necessarily doing a documentary approach to it. I mean, one could argue that Hank Willis Thomas's, branded head was prescient around Black Lives Matter and the challenges of Black lives as they engage with commodification and branding, which takes us all the way back to slavery. Or I'm also thinking of Nina Chanel Abney's incredible Untitled painting of 2017, who became in some ways the poster artist for the movement with some of her profound mid-teens paintings that show placards, that show protesters, but doing it in a way that was very fractured, delightfully fractured and high key, and on one part readable and another part impressionistic. So I think that my thinking in this last chapter had all of those ideas and issues in them, although it wasn't as explicit as a documentary representation of the events.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to know, maybe as one of our final questions, if revising and editing this volume inspired new ideas for future projects. Now, because there is, of course, a limit to how much you could add, say, to this volume, or maybe there wasn't, but I imagine that there was. I wonder if, for example, the developments that you saw or the new trajectories in different artistic practices made you think about a new book, a new show, or a new way of approaching this field. And in thinking about that, my mind goes to the Wangechi Mutu work that now is in my mind whenever I go to the Metropolitan Museum and look at the facade. There is a question about the future that the work poses. So I wonder if you might reflect on that.
Well, the absolute last section of the last chapter is called Afrofutures.
Yes.
And it pays tribute to something that's in the air. I talk about Black Panther as a cinematic cultural event, a film that got so many people excited and animated, but also the whole set of other artists like Nick Cave and Wangechi Mutu and others who, in their own ways, do work that is speculative, that thinks about the future and Blackness as in parallel relationship to one another. But actually, when you ask me what's next, I kind of want to go back to Nina Chanel Abney, because that cover that we chose for this new edition and her artwork, the painting that came out of it, really got me thinking about painting as a medium, as something that people might consider an old-fashioned medium. But it's clear a whole set of artists have really taken on this medium and done something fresh and radical about it. I've got to say that just while we have the cover up, Thames and Hudson has great designers, and they cut out a wonderful slice of that untitled painting. And I don't know if you noticed, but it almost looked like this figure on the left has a mask on. But this is 2017, Sarah. So Nina did not know that for the past year and a half we'd be wearing masks. So talk about somebody who's looking and thinking presciently into tomorrow. But that's a sidebar. Nina's getting me to think about color. Nina's getting me to think about painting. And so that's kind of where some of my new work is probably headed.
Well, we can't wait. I can't wait. I know many are also in that same position and thinking about this new volume, third edition of Black Art, A Cultural History. I feel really privileged to have it in my hot little hands, and I know many others will be able to feel the same way quite soon. In this audience, we have so many of the members of our community right here to celebrate you, and I hope that despite it being virtual, you do feel as feted and celebrated as I know we all want and so deeply feel. It is just a delight. It's truly an honor to be in conversation with you. I know that there are many other questions that people have, but this is probably just the beginning of the many ways in which we can engage around this volume and the book on painting, or perhaps show on painting to come. So I'd like to thank also the Hirshhorn for having this conversation. And Rick, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been delightful. Thank you for chatting with me.
Such a privilege and pleasure. Great.